So if you take a look online at what people are saying about the new Han Solo movie, you'll see that people's opinions have been a bit, well, mixed. Some think that it's a fun sci-fi adventure, some think that it's a giant waste of time. And if I'm being 100% honest, I'm leaning more towards the latter argument. If you want my quick 10-second review, I thought Solo: A Star Wars Story was an unremarkable sci-fi adventure with some occasional cool moments, but ultimately nothing that would warrant me going to see it a second time. It was the very definition of okay. But with a film like this, I'm not really as interested in reviewing it as analysing what it implies for the Star Wars franchise. Because even to this day, Star Wars remains one of the biggest movie franchises of all time, and to see an addition to its lineup be met with such derision and such underwhelming returns, that I think merits discussion. Because yeah, if you haven't checked the numbers recently, Solo hasn't been doing too well at the box office. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into my video on the problem with Solo: A Star Wars Story. And fair warning, spoilers ahead. I can't really get into this video without first talking about my own personal history with the Star Wars franchise. I've been a Star Wars fan for as long as I can remember. I mean, from the day my dad showed me that original trilogy on VHS, not DVD, yeah, none of that special edition crap, I've been in love with this franchise. I had numerous lightsaber toys, I wrote my own fan fictions, I even liked the prequels as a kid when they were coming out. Boy, did I bet on the wrong horse with that one.
You were the chosen one!
But to put it simply, I've always been a Star Wars fan and have even enjoyed the movies when they were at their absolute worst. And then came the newer films like The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and people's opinions have been, again to put it mildly, very, very mixed. Some consider them to be fantastic additions to the franchise and help to push the story in a new chapter, others consider them to be the living embodiment of Satan's balls on Earth. Now, as for what I think of them, that's honestly kinda hard to pin down. While I had fun with Force Awakens, I do acknowledge and take issue with the fact that it is way too similar to the plot of A New Hope. While I thought Rogue One was a cool perspective on the lead up to the original trilogy, I can't deny that the characters were bland, flat, and utterly uninteresting. While I liked seeing The Last Jedi push the boundaries of what makes Star Wars, I won't deny that it had more than a few slip-ups and was more than in need of a few rewrites before production took place. They all have merits, they all have flaws, and none of them are either the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, contrary to what some people online would like to say. And then we come to Solo: A Star Wars Story, which is, for me anyway, the most unremarkable Star Wars movie that I have seen since Attack of the Clones. There's very little in it that I remember that well, and the stuff I do remember is a little bit, shall we say, implausible, even for a Star Wars movie. Spoiler alert, the reveal at the end where it turns out that Darth Maul has been half manipulating the events of the film from the beginning is a twist that only makes sense to hardcore fans of the series who watch both the Clone Wars cartoon and the Star Wars Rebels cartoon. If you are anyone else on the planet, that twist just seems too far-fetched and unbelievably stupid to take seriously. And this brings me to my first big problem with Solo: A Star Wars Story. Much like many modern franchises, the creators have put a greater emphasis on expanding its movie universe rather than telling a compelling story. Now, this kind of thing isn't really new to Star Wars. I mean, there have been numerous tie-in stories in the past, such as books, cartoons, spin-offs.
Whip, whip, stir, stir, whip, stir, whip, 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 stir, wah!
Whatever this is. But in the case of those earlier tie-ins, it wasn't absolutely necessary for you to watch or read them to understand the movies themselves. If you watch the original trilogy, you don't need to read one of the countless spin-off books to get what's going on. In the case of Solo: A Star Wars Story, though, if you want to understand the ending, you've absolutely got to watch the cartoon series that came along with the previous films, or you're going to be completely lost. It's kind of like those games where you pay 50 quid for what was originally advertised, but then you find out you have to pay an additional £100 worth of downloadable content before you can access the full scope of what the game has to offer. It's kind of like that. It's just blatantly telling you that if you want to understand what's going on in this movie, you have to go and watch this other very, very loosely connected thing in order to catch up. At least with something like, say, Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it isn't absolutely necessary for you to watch that show to get what's going on in the movies. It's a nice little addition to the story of the MCU that you're already familiar with, but it's not something that you absolutely have to watch to understand everything else. Here though, the tie-ins feel less like a cool add-on and more like a homework assignment that your teacher gives you, and only a fraction of it actually applies to the thing that you're studying. It's the epitome of capitalizing on the nostalgia and commitment of fan bases, and I really hate it. It's also not helped by the fact that most of Solo: A Star Wars Story is built entirely upon references and nods to previous Star Wars films, or setups for potential sequels that have nothing to do with the movie that we're watching. Hey, have you ever wondered what the story was with those dice that Han Solo's got? No? Well, we're gonna show you anyway. Have you ever wondered how Han Solo got the Millennium Falcon from Lando? No, not especially. Well, we're gonna take up a huge section of the movie to tell you anyway. You want to see Darth Maul coming back to the films? Wait, he's alive? Of course! Don't you watch the cartoons? Having all of these references to other films doesn't make substance for a good movie, it just makes for a bunch of references to far superior products for the sake of appealing to fandoms and really nobody else. No one outside of hardcore Star Wars fans will either enjoy or understand half of the things that the movie is referencing. It's kind of the same problem as things like Ready Player One. Just because you have a bunch of references to things that people recognize, that doesn't mean that the movie has enough substance to survive on its own 2 feet. Then there's the problem of having the references be utterly integral to the story. I've gone over the problems of treating movies like setups for cinematic universes a dozen times over, so it seems pointless talking about it again. But to summarize, there's less of a chance that your story is going to be engaging if you rely so heavily on audience members remembering events which happened several movies ago, or in this case a completely separate cartoon series, in order to understand what's going on. And I know full well there's plenty of people out there who have seen the cartoon series, but the majority of people who are going in to see these movies most likely haven't, and that's a big problem. Now, none of this stuff is new to us. I mean, we've put up with a multitude of interconnected movie universes by this point, the most successful one being made by another company that is owned by Disney. But the fact that they're doing this to something like Star Wars, a franchise that is so iconic that most people have at least a passing understanding of it, whether or not they've actually seen it, something that many nerds have considered dear to their hearts for so many years, just adds to why Solo: A Star Wars Story is so depressing. It feels less like a cool new addition to the Star Wars franchise, and more like an aging rock star desperately trying to recapture the good old days that will never return. Because the main problem with Solo: A Star Wars Story, and indeed a lot of aspects of the newer Star Wars films, is that they've ultimately taken the magic out of Star Wars. And I don't mean in the way that the prequels did. The prequels were objectively, top to bottom, bad movies from episode 1 to episode 3. You can like them all you want, no one's saying that you can't enjoy them, but objectively there is no denying that they pale in comparison to the original trilogy. And while the newer films are likewise nowhere near as good as the originals, I think most of us can agree that they aren't as bad as the prequels. But the problem isn't that they are so much worse than the original trilogy, it's that they aren't much worse and they aren't any better either. They're somewhere in the middle, and that's kind of the biggest problem. They walk this middle line where they aren't as amazing or revolutionary as the original Star Wars, and nor are they as unbearably awful as the prequels. They're just kind of nothing, really. The one benefit of the prequels being as bad as they were was that it was easier for you to disassociate them from the original trilogy. You could watch them and go, yeah, this was garbage when it came out and they're garbage now, but I still can look back on the original trilogy with fond memories. But it's much harder to do that now with the newer films. They aren't good enough to compare to the original trilogy, and at the same time they aren't bad enough to dissociate them from it either. They just kind of exist in this nebulous nowhere state as Star Wars films that don't really have any purpose outside of just being Star Wars films. There's nothing really to be angry over, and there's nothing to be excited over either. They just exist, and as a result of that, the magic of Star Wars, that wonderful feeling that you had when you watched them as a kid, that thing that made Star Wars so special, is gone. And this kind of thing has been happening for decades now. Most of the old franchises have had newer additions made to awkwardly revive our nostalgic feelings for said franchise, only to fall completely flat. Be it Indiana Jones, the Alien movies, the Hobbit films, the Predator films, all they managed to accomplish by making making newer additions to these franchises is making the original films feel less special and sucking the magic out of what made them great to begin with. I watch things like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them or the Han Solo movie and I'm just like, I don't care. Let your franchise die with dignity and move on. It was great while it lasted, but we're getting bored of it now. And the fact that this has happened to Star Wars now is the final, most depressing nail in the coffin for me. All Star Wars is now is a franchise, and while that has always been the case, there was something about their prestige and rarity that made you forget that it was a franchise, even if it was only for a couple of hours. But the entire time I was watching Solo: A Star Wars Story, I couldn't get rid of that little voice in the back of my head saying, this is a franchise, this is an advert. When I watch the original trilogy, even the special editions, I get a sense of what moved me so deeply about watching them for the first time as a kid. Just being captivated by the spectacle and appreciating the care and passion that went into the production, and just how much those films have changed the landscape of modern movies. And when I watch the newer Star Wars films like Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and Solo, my feelings have just gotten a bit more mixed. I'm not able to turn my brain off and enjoy these films anymore because I've just seen so many of them. While there are creative decisions that I legitimately love and ideas and characters that I want to see explored, I ultimately am just left feeling somewhat hollow every time I come out of a new Star Wars film. I see all of these spin-offs and tie-ins with Solo and the upcoming Obi-Wan movie, and I just don't care anymore. It's lost the magic by this point, and I'm left wondering why I was even excited about Star Wars to begin with. And that's kind of the biggest problem with Solo: A Star Wars Story. It is the ultimate confirmation that the franchise that we sci-fi nerds have loved and known for so long is heading in a different direction, a direction that is more tailored to making as many films as possible in as little time as possible and cramming in as many references as possible for the sake of constructing a movie universe to reap as much profit as humanly possible. I can't say I hate any of the newer films, and I genuinely don't think that any of them are bad enough to hate, I just feel exhausted by them. I see all of the time and effort that went into making them, and I find it difficult to care, and as the years go by, I'm struggling to get excited for any of the newer films that are coming out. The simple fact that Disney and Lucasfilm have decided to do for Star Wars what they did for Marvel indicates that they've lost sight of what made Star Wars so enjoyable for so many people. They're just going to be pumping out Star Wars movies every year until the well has dried up completely, and as a result of that, the time will come, probably sooner than later, where all of us will be utterly sick to death of Star Wars. And can you honestly say that there is anything more tragic than that?